It's always going to be something. Okay. If there's any problems with the stream, make sure you mention it in the chat and I'll adjust. See if that helps. I'm doing the same thing every time, and it's always a different problem. Oh, good. Okay. So you guys can hear me, and it sounds good. It's not echoey right now. Okay. All right, I guess we can get started then. So we're ready to move on to chapter 4, and we spent chapter 2 and 3 learning about basic structures of HTML and CSS so that we can build a structure to hold the content on the page and then change the properties to make it look however we want, which includes changing the text color and the background color to the primary colors. But the rest of the book, we are going to take a look at basically specializing tasks that will allow us to have more control over the look of our page. So I mentioned this last time, but after chapter 3, if you feel like you made it through, and those were tough chapters, but you made it through, the rest of the course, this is where the learning curve levels off, because we're just learning more HTML elements and more CSS properties. And so you already know how to use elements in HTML, and you know how to create rules in CSS. So all you have to do is learn what they do. All right, so let's start. We're starting with an element here, a new element. Okay, here's the tag, HR, for horizontal rule. Remember, a lot of these elements were named a long time ago, so there's probably a historical reason why it's called that and not just horizontal line or HL. Anyway, it's a line here. This is a really quick and easy way to separate information on a web page, right? Pay attention to the tag though. It is a standalone tag, which means you do not need a closing tag. So I'll show you an example of where you might use this. Whoops, HRML. That's not what we're learning. Okay. So remember, when we're adding elements to the page that are going to show up on the actual web page, we put those in the body. So let's throw some stuff we used in here. fully review at this point. And so if you want to add some sort of visual separation to show that different parts in the text need to be separated or digested by the reader individually, you can use the horizontal rule. It's really this simple. And if you're just trying to throw together something, it doesn't need to be, it's not a web page that's going to be customer facing, but maybe internal facing, and you don't really care to spend the time to make it look good. This horizontal rule is a really cheap, easy way to organize information on a web page. Okay. So we're starting really slow in chapter 4, but now it picks up. So it tricks you by giving a nice simple element, and now we're being introduced to a new CSS property called border. And you'll notice in the actual rule here, we have the selector. Okay, it's selecting H2 tags. We've seen that before. No big whoop. Here's the new property. It's called border. That's easy to remember. But look at the value. What do you notice that's different about this value than any other value we've worked with in CSS? So what this is, well, you can see down here, this is what it's going to do. All right. So these, what do you think these represent? Okay. We talked about this in chapter 2. And then we talked about this in chapter 3. So what do you think those are? What do you think this represents? And how does that create this red box around an element? Assuming, this must be an H2, right? Because this is the rule that's being applied to it. All right. Well, they kind of give it away here. The values represent 3 different properties, and this is kind of a shorthand way to apply a border using CSS in one property. You can apply all 3 of these separate properties, which are how wide do you want the border to be. So here in this case they want 2 pixels, so you can see if you increase this number, the border will be thicker. Decrease, it'll be thinner. All right. So what do you think the default value for this is? What do you think the browser default is? Think about that. Here, this one is basically you can make the line appear differently. So here we're using a solid line, which is pretty self-explanatory, but we have other options that we'll take a look at later. And then you guys should recognize this as a number that represents a color, right? And if you remember from chapter 3 how you figure out, what color this is, you just Google it. Or if you like to understand the background behind things, remember, this number uses hexadecimal, so characters can go all the way through F, and the first 2 represent how much red is in the color, next 2 is green, and the last 2 is blue. So we have no green, no blue, and the full amount of red, so that's why it's red, right? So remember, there's a reason behind everything you're looking at, especially in a computer, any kind of computer language. Everything has to be exact. All right, so let's take a look about a little bit more about borders. And so this is eventually going to tie into a very important idea, which is understanding the difference between a block and an inline element. Okay, so remember, every element has some default settings applied to it. And one of those properties is called display. All right, and this allows us to control whether an element will take up an entire block on the page. So any other element within the same container will not be allowed to occupy the same horizontal space as a block element. And so we can see this here. You know, we have an H2, it is a block element, and we put a border around it down here, a red border, and you'll notice the border goes all the way across the screen. Okay, even though there's no text here, right? And we saw this with the background color property in chapter 3, but you can see it again with the border. Okay, and so down here we have an anchor element, and remember that creates a hyperlink, and it is an inline element. And we can tell because the border only goes around the text, so the element only exists it can exist in the same line as other inline elements, but not block elements. All right. So here are some examples of the different line styles that you can use. So we saw a solid in the example, and there's quite a few you can choose from. The reason they're showing the line styles from two different browsers is because, well, what it says here, browser display can vary. What that means is not every browser manipulates or displays each property the same. All right, so the same property across different browsers can do very different things. This is a very minor example of that. You'll notice, the dash lines here, for example, in Firefox, have, more space between them than the dash lines on Internet Explorer. When would that ever be important? Well, if you are ever designing a website for a large business or marketing material, companies tend to have style guides, and they can be very specific, and so there could be a rule regarding dashed lines requiring a certain distance between the dashes. So in this case, in that case this would matter, but in most cases it's not going to make that big of a difference. Now, one thing that could make a difference is if browsers ever display things in different sizes. That's a huge one, because layout on a web page has to be extremely specific, and you could build a site that works in Chrome, for example, but if in Firefox any of the properties adjust the size of an element, it could throw everything off, and so it would look really bad for the company or whoever the website was for, if it didn't work in a major browser. So how do you prevent that? Well, one thing you can do is, if you do design websites as a job, what you would do is you would test your website on every major browser and potentially every major device, just to see that it appears correctly, and then you can make adjustments from there to make sure it all looks the same, and if not, at least make sure it all looks good. Alright, so more about the borders. Alright, so besides just putting a border around the entire element, you can use these properties to target specific sides of the border. Alright, and I'm going to highlight in the exercises, you will be asked to create an element with an underline. It'll say that verbatim, create an element with an underline of a certain color or something. There is an underline text property that allows you to put an underline in the text, but you can't control the color of that separately from the text. So that is not what it's asking for. Just remember, here they're giving the example of border bottom. This is what the book is referring to as an underline. Okay. They specifically make those exercises kind of vague because if you needed to do this as a job or as a task, the person asking you for something isn't going to tell you that they want a CSS rule for the H2s that have a red bottom border, right? They're going to say, I want this spot or this text to be this size and have a red underline. And then you would translate that into this, an H2 element and a CSS rule. Okay, so that's why the book is kind of vague on those exercises that you do yourself. It's because you can't really do them unless you understand what is being asked, and you have to understand what was talked about in the chapter. All right, anyway, the reason I bring that up is so many people get confused by that. So if you watch this video before you do the homework, then you'll be prepared. Okay, so also with this, instead of just applying the border to one side, you can have borders of varying colors or properties all the way around your element. So let us create a rule for H1s. I'm going to use embedded CSS, so I need to add a style tag in the head section so that the browser can interpret the CSS within the HTML file. The reason I'm using it is so we can just have it all on the same window as we look at it. So H1s, let's give it a border top of 7 grooved green, right? And we'll try a border left of 3 dotted blue. And then try to realize what I forgot. Oh. Unit of measurement, right? It doesn't know what 7 is. It knows what 7 pixels is. Alright. Well, I see one of them. Maybe it wasn't grooved. I never use these other border styles. Oh, it's just groove. Okay. There we go. So we could put a different border all the way around the sides. Why you would do that, that's up to you. Now you know how. Keep that in your back pocket. So now that we've introduced borders, you can easily see the amount of space that an element takes up on the page. And we can start to think about that white space that is around an element. All right. So for us, up until this point, here's what an element would look like. just a floating text on a white background, right? And so any space that it takes up is, we have no idea how to understand that or what's involved in that. This might be easier to see without the grid lines. There we go. All right. Very sensitive. Oh, zooming. All right. And so now we're introducing, you know, border. Okay. And we now have an element. Okay. I'm going to put a different type of line around this, if I can. Oh, it's editing the text. Here we go. Select the object. What I'm trying to show you is how to see and understand the space around an element and how to manipulate it. Okay, let's go with a very almost imperceivable line. Okay, so the dotted line here just represents the amount of space that the text of the element is taking up, right? And so outside of that, we have the actual border. Okay, so here's the border. Obviously, it takes up its own space outside of the space that the element takes up. Okay, so whatever size you set the element to, you have to add the space that you're adding to the border. When you're actually designing layouts, and we'll get into, you know, doing that, I think in chapter 6 and beyond, it focuses on different types of layouts. There is a lot of planning that has to go into it to make something, anything very complicated. So we, you know, in the class we stick to, you know, the basic building blocks, but you can take that and expand on it and understand how you would plan a more complicated layout. And it involves a lot of, I guess I wouldn't say a lot of, but a little bit of math, just so you know what space is available and how you're using it to make sure things line up. Anymore, there are a lot of tools also that can help you. There are CSS templates. There are basically you don't always have to start from scratch. I mean, in this class you do, because I want to make sure you understand. But in the real world, there's so many resources. Okay. Anyway, the idea that I want to add here is, what the heck are we going to call the space between the element and the border? All right. What are we going to call that? So that is actually called, am I making it clear or more confusing? It's called the padding. Okay, so we can actually adjust the space between the border and the element by adding and removing space. All right, and so it shows in the PowerPoint. It's just a new property. Give it a value, and it will increase the space between the element and the border. So let's just take a quick look at that. Let's make a normal border for these paragraphs. So we got some normal borders here that we can see. And we can just adjust the padding. Let's try 20. And notice how, because we're manipulating the space, watch how it moves everything on the page. All right, so now this element starts farther down. Right now we're really just affecting the vertical space on the page. We'll learn how to design, across the page so that we can have multiple columns later on. Right. So there it is with 20. Let's try 0. All right. And then the funny thing is, if I put 7 here, it does nothing, right? Because I need to put the pixels. Because it could be 7 pixels, it could be 7, any unit of measurement, right? The computer doesn't know. But if I use 0, it will still use 0 pixels. What do you think that is? Why do you think it will use 0 without a label, but other numbers require a label? Think about that. See if you can figure it out. All right, so just like border, you can use padding to adjust each side of the element. So you can put more padding above the element or below the element, or left or right, or combinations, just like with a border. So if we change this to padding top 100 pixels, we will have a bunch of space above, okay? And let's say, oh no, this is too close to the line down here. It makes it slightly more difficult to read. We need to add more space below the element, but within the border. We can add a little bit of space there. Okay, and maybe not everyone would agree with me on this, but your first and foremost job, if you're ever in charge of designing a web page or a website, is make it readable or usable for whatever purpose it's going to be. You shouldn't sacrifice the functionality for aesthetics in this case, right? A web page, if you want it to be something useful, I mean, you're totally free to make whatever you want. But if you're doing it to actually solve an issue or help people, you should really focus on making it usable first. So things like adding a little bit of padding to the bottom here, it may not seem like it changes much, but if you had to read a bunch of these, it makes a slight enough difference that having that space just improves readability, makes it easier for people's eyes to focus on what they need to see. And so, for example, having this T up against the border there, that's bad. How would we fix that? Well, we need to add space to the left. And to do that, we just do padding left. We'll do 3 pixels on that one. We'll see. And you can trial and error it. Or you can look up design documentation that explains, common or best practices. And if you really want to go crazy, you can study the psychology behind reading and visuals, and you can get as in depth in it as you want. It gets pretty interesting. It helps you realize or notice patterns of why things the way they are. Why things are the way they are. Okay. do stop me if some of this isn't making sense. I'm just assuming because at this point we've looked at HTML and CSS, adding new elements and properties should be as simple as just demonstrating them to you. But if it doesn't make sense, don't hesitate to ask questions, especially when you get to the exercises if you get stuck. And if you really are having trouble understanding what it's asking, definitely let me know. And on top of that, that means you should probably look at the exercises, you know, potentially before the day that it's due, just because that's my high email traffic day. You know, I think you can imagine why. But you're going to get more help if you start earlier. Okay, another thing you can do with padding is use some shorthand. I don't know what I want to call it. I'll just call it a shorthand with padding. Okay, where did I leave that? Okay, so take a look at this example. They're setting padding to 20 pixels and 10 pixels. All right, so this is just instead of setting padding top and bottom to 20 pixels, which would take 2 lines, and setting padding left and right to 10, which would take an additional 2 lines, instead of writing a rule that would take up 4 lines, we can use this shorthand. The first value, if you give padding, the padding property, 2 values, it will use the first for the top and bottom padding, and the second for the left and right. Okay, and you can even go crazier and use 4 values here. And what you do is you think about this like a clock. And so each number represents a different side. So just so you can see that, let's just show that here. Let's show an example of creating a class. So I'll create a class called Crazy Padding. And let's make these even more distinguishable. So let's do 100, 50, 25, and 0. Okay. Now it's not going to do anything yet, right? What do I need to do to actually apply those rules to something on the page? Well, let's try applying it to the second paragraph. So I want to apply the rules, the CSS rule here, so the class of Crazy Padding, to this element. How would I do that? This is from the end of chapter 3. There's a second part anyway. You use the class attribute, right? And in there you give it a value of Crazy Padding, or whatever you named your class. Okay, and then we'll take a look at that, and we'll see how the padding changed. Now, the right side padding on a block element is not going to be visible in this case because of all the empty space over here. So let's try adding some more text. See what that does. All right. So obviously the top is getting the 100 pixels, and then just like a clock, it continues to the right. And now here is our 50 pixel margin, and we'll check that. We'll see if it limited where the wraparound was. And then the bottom is the 25 and the left is the 0. So it's just like it goes clockwise, starts at midnight or noon and goes around the clock. Okay. Am I pushing the clock metaphor enough on this one? All right. So if we want to, there's another way you can see this. I'm gonna open this in a new tab here. It's probably a little bit easier to understand, which is you can open the page inspector here by hitting F12, clicking select this selection box here, and it lets you highlight different elements. And then what it does is it color codes the actual space taken up by that element. Okay, so you'll see there's a bunch of colors around each element. So let's take a look at this one, this paragraph here, right? It's a paragraph element, and then the if you guys can see this, I'm not sure if it's visible or not on this screen, or if it's too small, but in the top left here, it shows us that this is a P element, and it says P dot crazy padding. So it is a paragraph element with the crazy padding class, and then it tells us the values for the color property, font, margin, and padding. All right. And then I guess I've never really paid attention to this, but the bottom part looks like it's grading you on accessibility. And so it looks like I did okay with contrast. It's harder, I think it might be harder to find a better contrast than black text on a white background. But it says it's not keyboard focusable, and that's a downside. Some people read a web page using a keyboard and a speaker. All right, so if they can't use their keyboard to move through the page efficiently, they're not going to be able to use your website. So it's saying you failed in making your website accessible. That's okay. You know, this is really just for me and I guess you guys to learn how to use this. But it is important to know or be aware of accessibility in web page design. I think currently universities, it might be just state universities, but it might be all universities, I would have to Google it, can be sued if their websites aren't accessible. I don't think that extends to companies yet, because that represents, you know, a lot of money to make your website accessible. Most companies make their website accessible anyway because that increases their audience. But if you're a smaller company and you can't afford to make your website accessible because maybe the increased audience doesn't justify the amount of work that it takes. And then there's always the ethical side of it, which usually takes a backseat to the business side, but you know, in this class we're gonna try to be as ethical, you know, focus on things that are ethical, and then you have to make that decision when you're in that position. Okay. No pressure, right? Alright, so let's take a look at these questions. Is it reasonable to try to code a web page that looks exactly the same on every browser and every platform? Well, we just looked at how one example shows a different way, you know, two browsers display the same thing in different ways. In some cases that will make you think twice about using that. You know, it's usually a bigger issue on new features being added to browsers. So every feature that we enjoy on a web page was, you know, besides text and links, you know, it all started with text and hyperlinks, but once they added images, there was, you know, one graphical browser. No other browser could load images, so there was no standard. And then, you know, we've added all kinds of things like animation and interactivity, but usually one browser implements it first, gains popularity, and then the other browsers have to catch up. But in that meantime, as a designer, you have to decide, am I going to use this new feature? It's only going to work for people using this browser, or do I wait until it's more acceptable and then fall back on an older, outdated, well, I guess outdated is not a good word, but the tried and true way to implement it. Which means it's really important to test your website on as many browsers and devices as you can throughout the design process, because it would be a nightmare to spend all the time and then find out that it's not going to work. Okay, so there's my long-winded answer on that. I'm not sure if I actually answered the question, but gave you something to think about. Number 2, there's an error in this code. I'm not going to point this one out and let you guys see if you can figure it out. If you can't see it immediately, think about how you could, let's say you didn't have time to pour through code like this to find the error. Is there a tool you could use that would tell you where the error is? We have talked about one in class, so even if you know the answer, copy the code into Replit and then see that it causes an error. You'll have to put an H2 on the page to test it. And then you can try and fix it in there, see if what you thought is correct. And then even if you do figure it out, try putting it in the CSS validator with the error and see what it says. All right. True or false? CSS can be used to configure visual elements such as rectangular shapes and lines on web pages. This is actually one of my favorite parts of CSS, is you can use it to design rudimentary vector graphics. So a vector graphic is an image that is generated based on an equation or formula, I guess. And that formula is infinitely scalable. So what that means, let's see if I can find a picture here. Let's take a look at this picture. All right, this might be a bad example because it's pixel art, but if I zoom in, you can see where, where there are supposed to be rounded edges. You can see, this is very exaggerated because it's pixel art, but this is a raster image, so it's not infinitely scalable. If you zoom in or blow it up to a larger size, it's going to be unrecognizable as what you're looking at, right? But with a vector graphic, you can increase the size and you'll never see these edges unless you specifically program them in. All right. So how can you do that with CSS? Well, right now there's not that much we can do until the end of this chapter. We can do some cool stuff, but once we get into positioning, you can really go crazy. Okay, so let's go ahead and above this paragraph, I'm going to put a div. I'm going to give it a class of box. Okay. And then I need to create a rule to manipulate that, so it's .box. And I can set the height to 100 pixels. Set the width to 200 pixels. Set the color, background color to blue. And set the border to 5px solid red. Okay, And so let's see if it allows me to even control the, yeah, there we go. So, you know, you can create, right now we're just limited to rectangles, but you can create, you know, rectangles of varying sizes. You can put rectangles inside of rectangles. So, you know, if you wanted to make this look like a, I don't know, square house, can I do that? I don't think I could do that. Let's say I just want to put a window on here. Let's see if I could do that. Put a box within a box. Okay, so I'm going to need another set of rules for a different size box. And we'll call this window. Let's change this to brown. And that's fine. We'll set the window to blue, and we'll give it a brown border. Okay, and then first let's put the window below the box. Okay, that's probably too big of a window, so let's make it smaller. We'll make it 25 by 25. All right, there we go. And let's say we want that window to go in, you know, we want it to go in there. How would I do that? I can do it just by manipulating the HTML. Get rid of that for now. So we have the box and the window. How can we get the window to go inside the box the way we have this set up? Think about it. We did talk about something in chapter 2 around the time we talked about divs, something called nesting. So we can actually put elements inside of each other. I mean, we're already doing that. These are divs that are inside the body, and we put paragraphs inside of divs and things like that, but we can put a div inside of a div. Okay, and then probably should do this so we can see. And then there we go. And let's say we want to put the window, you know, over here. Well, we imagine the top, we need to move from the top a certain number of pixels, and we need to move from the left a certain number of pixels. How would we do that? Well, we just learned we could use padding to do that, to adjust the distance between element and its border. So let's move. I think this is going to work, not for the reason I thought it was, but by accident. Okay. Let's just add some padding and see where it goes. All right. Well, that allows us to make the window bigger. We actually need another property. I was thinking ahead. We need another property to be able to move the space outside of the border. I'll just, you know, give you a sneak peek. The space outside of the border is called margin. And so when we use padding, it's actually increasing the space between the border of this element and the element itself. So it's just increasing the size, basically. But here, when we use margin, it's just pushing it away. And we can see that too. If I open this in a new window, we can look at it with the inspector. So here's the window. We can see the margin added to it which is the brown color. If you look, I guess my head is probably blocking it, but, well, I guess it's only blocking it a little. But go ahead and open your inspector in the browser if you want, and you can see this little chart in the bottom right. It shows you the color coding. So the blue in the middle represents, you know, the space that the element itself takes up, okay? And green represents padding, so neither of these have padding right now. The border is represented by a light tan beige, and then the margin is represented by a darker tan. All right. I wonder if they chose colors that aren't commonly used, so it would contrast with the actual colors used on the web page, but I don't know about that. Okay. Anyway, I guess all that was to show you you can create lines and shapes with CSS. So if we wanted to make a line, for example, we could just change the height of this to 10. Well, let's not change this one. Let's change. Maybe we want a nice bay window, right? Not a cheap square window. Let's change the width. We can just increase the width here. Actually, let's make it taller too. We want all that sunlight to get in. There we go. Now that's a window. And so if we want a line, we can just shrink this down. Have a vertical line. Or a horizontal line. Okay, and so you could, you know, once we get into positioning with margin and then actual positioning using the position property, you can basically move these shapes around and manipulate them to create things like company logos or simple graphics. I think I have a good example here. And then this will probably be the end of part 1 of chapter 4 here. Let's see. Whoops. That's not what I wanted. This is cool too, though. We'll get to the using animation in CSS. That's not what I was looking for. That's not it. That's Java. Oh, I should have put a star on it. Well. Oh, here it is. Wow, I actually found it. I'm like a digital hoarder. So here, you know, this is an example I used in a different class, but maybe we'll do it in this class once we're ready. To draw a piece of fruit using CSS, and so my example was an orange here, and so, you know, later in this chapter we'll look at how to make circles and different shapes using CSS. But I just have a brown line. Here's a rectangle with rounded corners for a leaf. You know, I could have went in and drew lines on the leaf if I had the time. Now, why would I do that? Why would I do that? I could just, instead of programming the code to generate a picture of an orange, why wouldn't I just use an image? There's a couple reasons. The one I talked about before was, the image is infinitely scalable. So if we open this in a new tab, this one will make more sense because it has rounded edges. And you zoom in, you're never going to see the jagged edge that's caused by raster images, because every time you increase the size, it just recalculates the formula to draw the image at that size. So it's dynamically scaling. All right, now I'm not going to win any art awards for this, and the more complex, you're never, well, I'm not aware of a way to create raster image level quality using a vector image, because at a certain point the formula for generating the image, it becomes larger than the file size of the image, of the potential image you would use, which is the other reason we might use vector, CSS to create images like this. If you include images on your web page, which we will do in Chapter 4, that creates another thing that needs to be sent to the person requesting the site. They have to request the web page, and then the server gives them the web page, and it also sends all of the resources needed to build the web page, including any images. And so if I find a picture of an orange, and I've learned to be very specific in my Google image searches, so take that for what you will. I just want a small picture of an orange, so I'll go to Tools. I want it small. Alright, so here we go. This looks a lot better than the orange I drew with CSS, right? If I showed you this picture and I said, what is this? I don't think you would have any idea, or I'm sorry, any problem saying, oh, that's an orange. Maybe you would say tangerine. I would know what you meant. If I showed you this without any context, you might say, I don't know, is that a golden delicious apple? Is it a peach? It's good for logos and things because there's usually context related to that. But the other thing I wanted to show you was, how big is this image? Well, we'll just download it. Oh, it is a tangerine. My bad. I'm embarrassed as a consumer of fruit. Okay. So this picture is not very big in terms of the resolution, and in terms of the file size, which matters when you're sending data over the internet. We are 50.7 kilobytes. Okay, in today's computing world, that may as well be nothing on your own computer. But in terms of data being sent, if I access a website that only uses this picture, big whoop, I have to download 50 kilobytes. It's not going to take me that long. But think about it the other way around. The company that's providing that website, if they have 1 million users a day, or a lot of users every day, every one of those requests is going to pull this image, and so For me, I only have to download that 50 kilobytes once. But for the server, it has to send that out to every person. So it's not as scalable. So it puts a lot of stress on the server by using images like this. When you could use something like what I showed you here. And so let's take a look at the actual size of this. How would you even know, right? Well, all we have to do is look at the characters that make up the code. So, you know, for the sake of simplicity, we're just going to consider the CSS characters required here. Alright, so what we would do is we would grab the code needed to generate this image. And I'll just use Notepad because I don't know, I don't think Notepad has all that much overhead in terms of space that it needs to store files. So I'm just going to paste the code in here, and I'm not even going to take the time to remove spaces and anything else that is not helping generate this image, because you could just put this all on one line and it would work. And take out all the spaces. In this case, you can take out all the spaces, but there are certain cases where you need to leave the spaces, kind of like in the border, or like in the border property we looked at. You need a space between the width of the border and the color and the style. Anyway, we'll save this as orange. Okay. And then let's take a look at how big that is. So it rounds up to 1 kilobyte in the display here, but if we look in the properties, we can see it's 447 bytes. So if we round that up to 500 bytes to make the math easier. And what was the other one? The other one was around 50 kilobytes, right? So 50 kilobytes, 1 kilobyte is 1024 bytes. So we take this times 1024 and we divide this by the 50 bytes of the size of the other one, and it is, since I rounded it, comes out here. And I did not realize I was just multiplying, dividing by the same number there, but the actual image file is 1024 times larger than the vector graphic in this case. Oh no. Oh no. Okay. I forgot to rename my ID on there, didn't I? Thank you, Miles, for pointing that out. Which, remember, this brings up a small point. You get to name the things in there. So the person that's using the website, most people aren't going to know to look at the code. Unfortunately, that's the case in our society. Not everyone knows how to properly. Well, it's just computer and internet literacy is very poor. So anyway, the point is, use names that help you. Calling it an apple, I'm sure at one point I had made an apple and then I forgot to name it to orange, but if I had handed this off to Miles to use in a page, if we were collaboratively working on a project and I labeled the orange as an apple, he would not appreciate that. So don't forget the other people that are going to be looking at the code. All right, anyway, I'll talk about this forever and we don't have time, so I will continue, and we'll probably finish chapter 4 next week. I'll be doing it again on Tuesday, since I did it Wednesday this week. if you're from either class, you're welcome to come to either live stream, obviously. And make sure you, if you miss any, check the recordings. I added a playlist link at the top of the modules on each section, so you can catch any videos you may have missed. And I highly recommend using the YouTube play speed adjusting feature when you're watching videos. Today I feel like I'm talking really fast, but there are days where I just cannot formulate a thought without pausing it between every word. And I know that it can be painful to watch. So anyway, what you can do, if you weren't aware of this, and this is an extremely valuable tip because you can use videos online to learn about so much. And hey, if you could do it in half the time, why wouldn't you? So let me just choose a video here. Also, I just don't have time to edit out the beginning and ending. I'll get to it eventually, but you might have to skip ahead. So I'm just going to skip to the middle here where I'm talking, hopefully. I probably chose one.
So let's say he also works at MySpace. We would put a 3. And the reason I wanted to make it, point that out is foreign keys have nothing to do with being unique.
So you can go down to settings.
They're only to represent the relationship.
And under playback speed,
the data inside of the foreign key.
You can slow it down too if I'm talking too fast for you.
To you as the
you definitely can do that.
Person, or as the person using the data,
depending on the
from the front end,
I'll
it's just
crank it up to 2.
Useless information.
You do this, you'll actually get better at listening to people talk faster.
Okay.
I don't know. It's a weird thing to say, but anyway.
So you can see
here's what I sound like
this layout will allow us to scale, as many employees as we want, and then we can add new companies, and then we can put each person in their appropriate company. All of this to say what a view is. Okay. So if I have.
So that's probably not the best idea to go at 2 times speed, but even if you can stomach 1.25 or 1.5, you're going to be saving time watching the video.
I have my data stored in tables like this. I could print out, and someone wants a report. With,
okay. Anyway, you get the idea. So I will see you guys next Tuesday. All right. So if you need any help, make sure you email me, contact me, and we'll get it taken care of. Thank you very much, and have a good day. Oh, and Daniel, I agree with your comment. It's something I do like to mention in these early classes, but I push a lot harder in the upper level classes. If you are planning to, I know I said I was going to go, but if you are planning to go into this field as a career, so web developer or programmer or whatever, it's all the same now anymore. You're going to want to show portfolio work so people know what you can do. They're going to pay attention to what Daniel is describing as code hygiene. So they're looking for things like proper labeling, proper use of comments, keeping your lines to a certain length, things that people in this class, unless you've seen a programming language, probably doesn't make any sense. I mean, I guess in this class, the example would be, when we auto-format the HTML, so it makes it easier to read. But, HTML is such a simple language, we can have a computer format it for us. Not so easy with code. You have to make a lot of decisions on how to lay things out. All right, now I'm really leaving. Have a good day. I'll see you Tuesday.